This is Chuck Randall. He's training to be a fighter pilot and has about 40 hours in the P-39. Knows the airplane pretty well, too. He's not the hottest pilot in the world, but conscientious. He'll make a good flyer. Here's another of the boys. He has about as much time as Chuck, but a little different approach to his flying. For one thing, he didn't spend much time getting to know his airplane. It finally caught up with him. Coming in one day, his battery went out when the gear was only part way down. It was a funny thing, too, because the battery and generator had just been checked. Well, it meant emergency operation of the gear. He went through all the motions, but it didn't feel right at all. It cranked much too easily. It didn't seem to be engaging. Reason? Well, he didn't wait to find out. He had other plans. Sure, it was a safe landing. He didn't have a scratch. But it was a pretty sad-looking airplane. He didn't look too happy himself, and with good reason. In the first place, if he'd had the clutch handle to manual, he could have cranked the gear down without any trouble. In the second place, if he needed help remembering emergency operation, there's a card of instructions on the door. In the third place, if the generator had been on, the battery wouldn't have gone dead in the first place. The moral of that story is, know the airplane you are about to pilot. Now, flying the P-39 is not a lot different from the advanced trainers you've been flying. It has more power, it's faster, and it's very light on the controls. But just as with any new airplane, the more you know about it, the better you'll fly it. Much of the information you need, you'll get from your instructor. Some of it you'll get from talking it over with other men who are in training with you. But the best reference guide is your own experience. It's something you'll always have with you. So keep it up to date. Well, now let's start at the beginning with Chuck and see what he found out. What do you say, Chuck?
Okay, sir. Well, after the tech orders and a thorough check of the cockpit, I was ready to give it a try. With the tail in the air, I could see where I was going without essing. She taxied very easily with short bursts on the throttle, and I let her coast a lot. Didn't have to use much brake. Getting her in the air was all right. As a matter of fact, it was fun. I'd never flown that much power before, and I was surprised how easily she handled. But I hadn't never landed a tricycle gear job before either, so I guess I was a little uncertain about bringing her in. I could see I was coming in pretty fast, and there wasn't going to be enough runway, so I gunned her to go around again. I knew the fellows were watching, but I figured I could live that down easier than messing up a nice new airplane. Then I brought it in again. Landing instructions said it was just like landing any other airplane, and I took them at their word. I rolled out of the turn at about 140, lowered my flaps, and established a steady glide at about 130. This is how it looks to the slow-motion camera. I came in over the end of the runway at 110, leveled out, and got the airplane in a conventional three-point landing attitude. I set her down on the two main wheels, holding the nose wheel off the ground with a slight back pressure on the stick. I found that I could hold the nose wheel anywhere from a few inches to 2 feet off the ground and still make a good landing. The airplane rolled straight down the runway, and I applied the brakes intermittently to lose speed. We don't roll up the flaps here until we park, since there are no stones to damage them, and there's less chance of hitting the wrong switch.
How was the first flight, Chuck? Have any trouble?
No, sir, it was okay. It was a lot different from what I expected. I guess you can't believe everything you hear.
Depends where you hear it. You can pick up a lot of information from hangar experts, all the free dope you'll want on any airplane, and they always have it on good authority. Well, to get on with Chuck's story, he was over the first hump, but that was only the beginning. He still had a few things to learn about flying the airplane. And aside from the cockpit, there was a lot he wanted to know about the airplane itself. It's good background. Might come in handy someday.
I was going into my transitional training, which began with 8 engineering missions designed to get me acquainted with the performance of the airplane and the operation of its engine. I was flying a Model N airplane and knew from the tech orders that if necessary, I could take off with 52 inches and 3,000 RPM, which is rated takeoff power. But in training, with the airplane making 8 or 10 takeoffs a day, we're instructed to keep it down to something less. Actually, it's possible to take off with as little as 35 inches. When I had sufficient altitude, I retracted the gear, and when I was up to a few hundred feet, eased back to 35 inches and 2,600. The going was smooth, and it sure felt good to be flying again. But I wasn't ready just yet to sit back and enjoy the scenery. There were a couple of things I had to keep an eye on. The press-stone temperature was under control. Oil temperature was about 70 degrees. Okay. Oil pressure about 70. Fuel pressure, okay. And I had enough airspeed, which is always a good thing to know. They say altitude is like money in the bank, and it's one thing the government has no objection to hoarding. Besides, when you're new to an airplane, it's an especially good idea to have plenty of space underneath you. I was on my way up to 10,000 feet. When I got there, I settled back and tried a few coordination exercises. In rolling into a turn, I found that very little rudder pressure was needed. You want to treat this airplane like a lady. Don't try to be fast or rough if you expect to get along with her. Then I tried a few gentle turns. At first, I had a tendency to skid or slip. The turning radius of this airplane is much greater than what I've been used to. It took me a while to get the proper relationship between the aileron and rudder. But by doing a few more and keeping an eye on the bank and turn indicator, I soon got the idea of how to coordinate properly, and they began to feel pretty smooth. Like all pilots who fly pursuit, it wasn't long before I got to wondering about the speed I could get out of her. So I poured on Nicole to see how she'd react. Up to 3,000 RPM and 52 inches. Incidentally, the tech orders say always increase RPM first, then manifold pressure. It's especially important in a high-powered engine like this. If you don't, you'll be building up excess pressure inside the cylinders, and it's liable to detonate and cause serious damage to the engine. With the increased power, temperatures and pressures went up, and I adjusted the shutters. 5 minutes is the maximum time for operation with this power, but I think you can find out what you want to know in less time than that. At least I did. I tried various combinations of mixture, RPM, and manifold pressure at different altitudes to get some idea of how these factors affected power. In my first mission, I tried a few partial stalls with the gear and flaps retracted. I don't quite know what I expected, but I was pleasantly surprised. The airplane stalled very gently and had no tendency to drop a wing. There was plenty of warning before she stalled completely. Later, I carried this a little further and did a complete stall at 10,000 feet with the power partially off. That is about 15 inches. It broke clean at about 100, and to recover, I dropped the nose to let her pick up speed, about 180, before I started to pull her up. As the stall was explained to me, it's all a matter of airflow over the wing's surface. If the airflow is disturbed due to an increased angle of attack, the wing loses its lift and the airplane will stall.
When the airplane approaches a stall, turbulence begins at the roots. And as this section begins to stall, it causes a shuddering. The tail buffets slightly from the effect of this turbulent air. The stall progresses outboard and gradually affects aileron control. Just before the stall is complete, the entire aileron becomes ineffective. In recovery, the ailerons regain control before the wing is completely unstalled. So when you first feel aileron control returning, don't let it fool you. Don't start to pull up until you have sufficient speed.
Later, I tried some partial stalls with the gear and flaps extended. The stall characteristics were pretty much the same as in the clean condition, but with the stall occurring at a lower speed. With the power reduced, I pulled the stick back gently until gradually the stall point was reached. After she began to shudder slightly, at about 95, I eased gently forward on the stick. I let her pick up some speed in a shallow dive, about 140, and eased her back level. Knowing stalls is a pretty good way to get the feel of any airplane, so I practiced until I was sure of it. Then, with the gear still down, I trimmed the airplane for an indicated airspeed of 150 and tried some gliding turns for practice and landing approaches. I figured it'd be a good idea to try them first at a safe altitude where there were no traffic problems, and I could concentrate on getting the knack of a properly coordinated gliding turn. I knew that speed was important, and I didn't let it drop below 130. At first, I'd go beyond a medium bank. A steeper bank is all right, but it's easy to skid, and I wanted to be darn sure I didn't pull her in too tight. It wasn't long before I was ready to hang one on the beginning of a landing. I kept some power on and didn't cut the gun until after the turn. I could spot my landings pretty well now. Whatever uncertainties I'd had at first were cleared up after I'd made a few more. Another day, I gave some attention to climbing. With normal climbing power, 2,639 inches, she indicated 160, which is the best climbing speed. Compared to the trainers I'd flown before, this baby really climbed. At 12,000 feet, I put her in a dive. I'd tried a few before, and this time I wanted to get up to 400. I hadn't trimmed for the dive, and I found that I needed left rudder and some forward stick pressure to follow a straight flight path. At about 7,000 feet, I started to pull out very gradually. It didn't matter so much how fast I was traveling, just so I took it easy in the pullout. In a dive, the greater the speed, the more gradual the pullout has to be. I still had a lot to learn about the airplane, and flying tight turns was a good way to do it. It helps to develop the feeling for the airplane, which is so necessary for combat flying. It's important to be in full control at all times, and so it meant working up to them gradually. As I went along, I reefed them in tighter, and pretty soon was pulling them in almost to the stall point. I was making the turns as tight as I could without stalling out. There was a definite change in the feel of the controls just preceding the stalling condition. I could feel a buffeting on the tail, and the whole airplane shuddered. I got so I could recognize it and was able to prevent a stall by relaxing back pressure. Occasionally, I'd let her stall some, but it was easy enough to recover. The airplane unstalled quickly, and full control returned immediately. The speed didn't matter so much as the tightness of turn. The tighter the turn, the higher the speed at which I stalled out. I practiced tight turns on a number of missions and got to be pretty sure of myself, and probably a little careless. Because during one, I guess I must have pulled her in a little too tight. The airplane stalled, and I didn't relax back pressure quick enough, and I spun out of the inside of the turn. It caught me unawares, and it must have been a couple of turns before I started to recover. She responded promptly. I decided to check up on spins, and this is what my instructor had to say.
In this airplane, a spin is an irregular gyration going first slow and then fast in an oscillatory pattern. The first move, when you're aware you're in a spin, is to close the throttle and go into low RPM. As soon as the direction of rotation is established, bring the stick full back, apply full rudder with the spin, and hold until ready to recover. When the airplane comes to the slow part of its gyration, apply hard opposite rudder. A moment later, move the stick full forward and apply ailerons against the spin. As soon as the rotation stops, usually about 3/4 of a turn, it'll begin to recover in a steep dive. Neutralize all controls and wait until the airplane picks up speed and feels normal. Then gradually start to pull up, and recovery is completed. In the P-39, as in most airplanes, a spin is easily and quickly recovered from, if not permitted to progress too far.
I was familiar with the feel of the basic maneuvers and could coordinate each of them pretty well. Next, it was a matter of combining them, and the Lazy 8 was a good way to do it. It's a valuable maneuver for developing coordination, since it involves motion about all three axes of the airplane at the same time and through a wide range of speeds. I started them from cruising, pulling up in a bank not more than 70 degrees at the steepest point, with a minimum airspeed of 160 at the top of the arc and not exceeding 300 at the center of the 8. When I could do a good job of these, I felt I was well on my way to mastering the airplane. Next came the two-plane element, flying with my instructor. We talked it over first on the ground and checked on signals. We took off individually and got into formation in a gentle turn. In loose formation, we climbed to a safe altitude. At 10,000 feet, I trimmed out the ship and pulled up into formation on signal. Keeping it fairly loose, we tried some gentle turns. I was flying on the inside and found that at first I had a tendency to over-control. But brushing up on the old fundamentals of position, distance, and smooth throttle coordination, it wasn't long before I could do a fairly decent job of following around in a turn. Actually, with the additional power and increased speed range of the airplane, I found it was easier to fly good formation in the P-39 than in the training airplanes I'd flown before. Then we tried some climbs. It was good practice for coordinating my speed and throttle settings with the leaders. And then some dives. Pretty gentle at first, and then steeper. I was becoming accustomed to flying formation at higher speeds and in sharper maneuvers. With several two-plane missions behind me, I felt pretty much at home in formation. I hadn't done much in the way of acrobatics in the airplane and felt about ready for it. Double-checking my shoulder harness lock, I tried some rolls. Starting at cruising, it rolled very easily and had a good response to the ailerons. The stick pressures generally were much lighter than I'd been accustomed to, and she responded quickly and smoothly. Although a pretty easy maneuver, it sure built up my confidence. Then came loops. During this maneuver, the airplane flies through two speed extremes, high at the beginning and end, and low at the top. Trimmed for cruising, I applied left rudder as I pulled up. As the speed decreased, I relaxed rudder pressure. As the airplane continued up, I applied right rudder. On the downward arc, as the speed increased beyond cruising, I relaxed right and gradually applied left rudder. Straight back on the stick fairly hard so as to maintain sufficient speed to carry me through at the top. Nearing the inverted position, I relaxed back pressure slightly and stretched my neck backward as far as possible to see the horizon when it appeared. I could use it as a reference in keeping my wings level. Then on down and around. After more acrobatic practice, I felt I could handle the airplane in all attitudes and was confident in trying my hand at more advanced maneuvers. Something my instructor said helped.
With proper instruction, you should feel no apprehension about attempting almost any maneuver, and you'll find that very often fear of the unknown is removed by deliberately doing what you're afraid will happen.
All my training thus far had pointed toward one thing, and now I was ready for it. Gunnery. These planes are built around their armament and are equipped to deliver a lot of firepower. First, I tried my hand at ground targets. With fixed guns aimed to fire along the axis of the airplane, I knew the projectile would strike the target only if I were flying a straight, true course. It meant having the ball in the center. With the ship in a skid, there was a horizontal component, and I hit to one side of the target. And the speed I was traveling at was important, too. Below the recommended speed, the airplane was inclined above the flight path. At higher speeds, it was inclined below the flight path, introducing a vertical component. I started at 2,000 or 3,000 feet in a steep dive and flattened out to make an approach at 15 to 25 degrees to the horizon. I found I could come down pretty close and still not have to pull out steeply or abruptly. Next came water targets, and here I had to be even more careful in my pullouts. I didn't hit very much at first, but I was told not to be too concerned. Accurate judgment of speed and timing in pullouts can only be attained with many practice runs. Since this airplane has proved an effective weapon for attacking ground objectives, my training included low-altitude flying and simulated strafing. Then came deflection gunnery practice on aerial targets, making dry passes at another ship. I started with a small amount of deflection, turning to keep lead on the target. Gradually, I increased the speed and narrowed the angle. And it soon became evident that my practice in tight turns was time well spent. Just lately, I've been practicing with live ammunition on a towed sleeve, which brings me pretty well up to date. As a matter of fact, I'm due for a mission right now. So long, fellas. See you around.
Thanks, Chuck. You men going into training in this airplane will probably cover much the same ground, perhaps in much the same way. You'll be flying an airplane which is fast and powerful. It is sensitive to the controls and quick to respond. Know thoroughly its characteristics, and when you join the men now in combat, your job will be easy, and like theirs, well done. For in the various war theaters, the record shows that when American fighting men, in fighting airplanes, set out for an enemy objective, the report is sure to be mission accomplished.